Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz Podcast. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome to you,
Thank
Josh. And Matt Van Milligan. Welcome to you, Matt.
Hello.
So every once in a while, we get into some topics that are a little bit
Risque?
spicy, risque, controversial. And that's what we do sometimes because, we have to talk with them. I hear a lot of people say, oh, wow, I can't believe you guys talked about that on your podcast. And it's like, well, that's part of our thing is it's an area for us to learn even about topics that aren't comfortable to hear about.
And the church, contrary to popular belief back in the day, the church isn't scared to talk about these issues.
Absolutely.
And so like some things like that are meant for the bedroom aren't just meant for the bedroom. The church has actual rules and regulations and has I'm going to say experience with what the church teaches around things like sex.
Right.
So I guess one of the big things is if people are listening to this with their children, we're going to get into some deep, heavy topics that you might not want your children to hear.
On today's episode
Specifically.
We're going to be talking shop.
Yeah.
Talking shop. So what we're talking about is just a couple weeks ago, maybe a week ago, Pope Francis was talking about surrogacy in a speech to all the world's ambassadors to the Vatican. And he was talking about that he actually called surrogacy deplorable. And he called for a global ban on the exploitative practice of so-called surrogate motherhood. And for those of you maybe who are just hearing about surrogacy, I guess the best way to explain surrogacy would be it's an arrangement you make for someone else to carry your child.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Multiple different reasons
for any reason. Right. So we're talking that the male's sperm and the woman's egg, like let's say a couple, and they use another woman, like a third party, to host that, right? And
the baby.
and to give birth to the baby. And then, or it doesn't have to be like that. It could be multiple different scenarios that happen.
Multiple different donors or whatever the case may be, but specifically around, the best way I can say is renting out a womb.
Yeah.
Right.
Like having someone bring the baby to term.
Exactly.
For
and
you.
Pope Francis says that it's a grave violation of the dignity of the woman and the child, based on the exploitation of situations of the mother's material needs. He says a child is always a gift and never the basis of a commercial contract. So we're going to talk today about surrogacy. We're going to talk about other methods that the church deems morally unacceptable as well.
Yeah, so there are a couple kind of dimensions to what's going on here, because a lot of the commentary or a lot of the initial response really jumped on, surrogacy itself. Yes. So the Pope's context here, he's talking about commercial surrogacy specifically, but then when he's calling for this, the international kind of powers that be to come together and ban surrogacy across the board, a lot of people, their initial response was, what's the big deal? So it's like, okay, some countries have already banned commercial surrogacy because they recognize that it can be an exploitative practice for, the woman carrying the child. But there are kind of broader situations where people would choose surrogacy. So a lot of the commentary is like, well, the Pope doesn't really know about this, but the fact is that there are a number of kind of moral dimensions to this. Some of it has to do with the actual process by which surrogacy takes place, and more than that, I think the Pope is actually aware of all of these other these other factors that the context for surrogacy is actually separated from all of the church's teaching on sexuality, procreation. Looking at we had an episode a little while ago when we looked at kind of Humanae Vitae and theology of the body. That there's a lot more going on in surrogacy than a lot of people who are initially reacting are aware of.
And just to clarify, when we're talking commercial surrogacy, we're talking someone using another person's womb and paying for it,
Yeah.
right? So if someone says, okay, well, I'll be the surrogate mother for this amount of money, and so it's almost becoming like a business,
A transaction.
right? A transaction.
Yeah.
But that's not the only type of surrogacy that Pope Francis was saying that was deplorable.
He was talking about surrogacy in
in
general.
general, and I'm going to read what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says. It's not just Pope Francis having a bad day and talk about surrogacy. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2376, it says, techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple, bracket, donation of sperm or ovum, surrogate uterus, etc., are gravely immoral. These techniques infringe the child's right to be born of a father and a mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. They betray the spouse's right to become a father and a mother only through each other. Yeah. So that's the basis of
That's the basis right there.
Yeah. So
and we're done.
No, and I think this challenges a lot of people because, again, if you're not thinking about the theological dimension, if you're not thinking about how deeply connected, parenthood is to, the rights of a child to have, their biological parents be the ones. On the outside, surrogacy actually looks compassionate. A lot of the context for surrogacy is really sympathetic. Like if you have a couple who meets, most of these criteria that, they want to have a child but are unable to, kind of through natural processes or kind of their kind of normal again, depending on what the source of infertility is. It's like we want to recognize that a desire for a child within the context of marriage is a good, and it is an inherent good of that marriage. But again, we have to properly apply kind of the moral dimension. So like, if my wife and I want to have a child and, we can't just go kidnap somebody else's child. Like we can't, like there are like reasonable limits placed on the thing. So like while we can, rightly say and rightly be sympathetic for these situations where people want a child and can't have one, I think that does need to be stated kind of off the bat. There are people, well-meaning people who, may not necessarily be aware of all of these other kind of moral dimensions of what surrogacy involves.
Yeah. So, okay, right off the bat, I think most people can admit, and they can see the Pope's point when he says commercial surrogacy is wrong. I think when they're thinking of that, I don't know about you. When I hear commercial surrogacy, I take loved ones out of it. What I see there is a young woman rents her womb out. She's going to do this thing for 9 months, 10 months, and get $25,000 at the end of it. Yeah. This is a great way for her to pay off a college tuition or whatever the case may be. Why not? Why, she doesn't know the couple at all. She doesn't know anything about them. She reports to an agency. They match her up with a complete stranger. I think people can see that maybe renting out your body like this would be similar in similar ways to prostitution or into, right? Like where you're renting out a natural function to give someone else pleasure, if you will. Like that's,
Yeah, it's worth noting that surrogacy is like as an international business generates billions of dollars. It's big business. So again, some countries have banned commercial surrogacy just for that reason because there's a high potential for
and exploits women that way. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think if people can agree to that point, let's get out of that. Now, people are going to do it for compassionate reasons. They're not going to get paid at all. They're going to be it's a sister who is not married or anything else and decides to give her brother-in-law and her sister or whatever carry the child of her niece or nephew in their womb. It's a loving transaction. It's a compassionate transaction in that case, and they don't want anything out of it. They just want they're having the ability to be part of it or to give this couple that they love so much an offspring. Where are some of the problems that we see that lie in that type of transactions? We talk there about having the woman. The Catechism said the woman having, I can't remember exactly the wording.
Well,
the child having proper own.
It infringes the right of the child to be born of a father and mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. They betray the spouse's right to become a father and mother only through each other.
And the woman, there's something right before that, about the woman. I don't remember. Do you have it there?
It says that techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple are gravely immoral.
Okay. Yeah, so there's kind of two aspects of what you're talking about. On the one hand, you're removing conception from the marital act, like from the
sex.
Yes, from sex. So that itself is a violation of theology of the body, Humanae Vitae. So
let's put that in a package, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's that aspect that the proper context for conception is the marital act between husband and wife, father and mother. That is the proper condition or context for a child to be conceived. The other part of that is that the technique itself that's used to, facilitate surrogacy is almost 100% IVF, in vitro fertilization, which itself has its own kind of
flaws,
moral
okay,
problems.
so let's package that. So we got two things there. Package them up. What about then the other thing that I hear about or I think about too is after the birth. Let's just talk about what happens to the surrogate mother after the birth. They're like we know naturally, just speaking. Let's take the sex parts out and then the in vitro fertilization out. Mom decides, sister decides, does this thing and everything else. What are some of the natural processes there that happen because she's carrying a child? And so, I know of mothers who have miscarried their child, or I mean, some of the women that have abortions, and we're not going to get into that conversation, but like, there's a period of mourning there when they don't have this connection to this child, that there are hormones that are released to bond with this child.
Yeah. So it's not just like any other kind of financial or commercial transaction that you would have. There isn't just kind of a neat, tidy. This is what you purchased, hand it over, and there's no other implications there. Just the physiological implications of a woman carrying a child for 9 months, and one of the things that my wife knows a lot more about this than I do, and one of the things that she said is that
as a nurse practitioner,
yes,
just to clarify, people that don't hear the show,
and a mother,
and a mother,
two credentials that I do not have, saying that in the early days of a child being born, almost all of their connection to their mother has to do with release of hormones, oxytocin. Yeah. There's an incredible bond that takes place, in the kind of event of birth itself, but in the early days. And one of the strongest ways that a baby associates or its first kind of human connection is with its mother, because their vision is not very developed for the first week or so, and it takes a while for it to actually for them to be able to see kind of across a room, kind of thing. So their association immediately is with smell. So they know the smell of their mother as kind of the first smell. But again, this isn't detached from the rest of the process. This isn't just, you can hand the baby to someone else. And
this is your mother now, and
they'll just associate that smell, because they say that the smell of the mother is directly linked to what the baby would taste in the amniotic fluid in utero.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the baby has that it's familiar with it. Yeah. That's why, when my wife and I had little kids, it's been a while now, but when we had little kids in the bed beside us, it would turn towards Chrissy versus turn towards me, even though it's sitting in between us, right? And it can feel skin on either side, her arm or my arm. It automatically would turn to her arm and try to latch onto her arm because it knows the smell from being in the womb for 9 months. That's not something. So when a surrogate mother does that, the baby is naturally attaching itself to the surrogate mother in a way that can't be undone.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the process of IVF?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about surrogacy, there are, like you said, I think I agree with you there, Josh, for once, is that, when people hear commercial surrogacy, they might say, well, that's not right. You're paying for this. But if people hear about the compassionate surrogacy, they'll say, well, what's the big deal? And I think IVF is one of those issues. So IVF is in vitro fertilization, and lots of couples are going through IVF, right?
Yeah, this is the primary mechanism for
surrogacy.
For surrogacy,
yeah. I think it's just come to the point where it's been normalized.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't think people realize that it's not morally acceptable, right? in the eyes of the church.
Yeah. So what it does in vitro fertilization, what basically happens there is that we take the act of conception completely out of the marital act. So there's no sex involved in this necessarily. This is completely in the act of we take some egg, we do some surgery, or not some surgery, but we go in, we get some eggs from the woman, we get some sperm from the man. That doesn't involve surgery at all. There's a procedure. Yeah, let's say there's a procedure. But we get the sperm, we get the eggs, and we put them into it. Basically, I'm going to say a test tube. It's not always necessarily a petri dish of some sorts, and they put this stuff together so that these eggs, multiple eggs, as well as multiple sperm, they want the best chance of success, and that's 10%. So what they do is they take, let's say, 10 eggs. They put 10 eggs, and the best chance of success is normally about a 10%, meaning 90% of embryos that are conceived in this way are discarded and not being able to be used. So they take 10 eggs, they fertilize them. In the eyes of the church, life begins at conception. And so, at this point, when we put sperm and egg together, and then we form 10 little babies, we believe that
those are 10 lives.
Those are 10 lives in that dish. And so, then what happens? There's a couple different things. Sometimes they're frozen. Sometimes they're put away and frozen for a time that when the couple can afford it, or when the couple's, Other times, what they do is they go through and they say, oh, this one has a birth defect, or this has a little defect here. This could result in this mental disability or that physical disability.
Down syndrome is a part
is
of it.
a big one.
Yeah.
And
so
it's
so sad that they do that.
Speaking from an uncle of having my niece that's Down syndrome, like if you don't want joy in your life, exactly. One of the things that they are just joyful all the time. They don't have, the world never can go wrong with them. Anyways, but yeah, when you have, like, they go through and they look at the way that the embryo starts to develop and under a microscope, and then they can start to tell, okay, this one's probably this one's probably that. We're gonna take that out. They start to do genetic testing. Oh, these are probably gonna be boys. You wanted a girl. We're gonna discard those. So now we're this really becomes a transaction. This really becomes about like shopping for your baby. And what are you doing with the other 10 lives that you've just created? You're just killing them off. And so the church has a real problem with this. In the natural act, if this happens, I mean, because we know that miscarriages happen. We know that like there are natural ways that this happens, and there are natural things, like maybe the woman's body doesn't have the right hormones in place at the time and it aborts a baby. Miscarriages a baby. There's difference. But that's all naturally done versus this is actually choosing to create life and take life.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think some people might ask, okay, well, what's the difference? And it's like, okay, so you have people using this science or this technique to be like, okay, we'll do this until it works, until we get something viable, and then that's going to like, what's the difference between that and a husband and wife trying over and over and potentially miscarrying multiple times, having ectopic pregnancies, having like kind of the almost identical effect, but it's in the context of kind of the proper normal processes. That is the difference. That's what makes the difference. That trying to detach the creation of life from the sexual act itself, but also the difference of agency.
Yeah.
So if you have an ectopic, there's a very big difference between selecting an embryo and discarding it.
Yes.
Throwing away life. For whatever reason, your body rejecting an egg, or your body, you're not choosing. So from a moral philosophy perspective, the agency is fundamentally different. So for those who would ask, what's the difference between kind of trying this, just kind of trial and error in kind of the proper context versus trial and error through kind of this technique, that is the difference. The moral agency is fundamentally different.
Then, and the church stands by this not only at the moment of conception, but at the time of death. And we've talked about this before. But euthanasia being wrong because you are killing someone off versus taking someone off, pulling the plug on someone is different. Because they can't survive on their own. That's allowing them to die naturally versus giving them a formula, mixed concoction that would kill them. Yeah. And the church stands by that too. Like if they're going to die naturally, that's different. But like because the sanctity of life is still preserved then, right? Versus taking life. And so understand, like, the church stands by this at the beginning of life, and at that, like, when we talk about we support life, that's what we're talking about. So it's not that we don't support the life that happens during the surrogacy, although there are some problems there's some brokenness there that we talked about, but it's about the other 10 lives that are discarded during surrogacy that's also deplorable. It's the part that we don't agree with whatsoever. And so that, you know, like, it is something that happens. It's not, you can't take the one egg, or it's $10,000 a shot, if not more. I looked this up in the research of this podcast. $10,000 a shot, if not more. It's not like you would take, if they're going in and doing all this work, they're not, science just says you're not going to take one egg out, plant the one egg, and even if you're doing that, you're taking it as this marital act of sex, so it's wrong still. But even if you do it, just one egg, one sperm, put them together, you take it and you put it in the womb. Like, all this stuff, there's a very specific here. That's not how it works in science. So what you're going to do is you're going to take 10 eggs. You're going to take the best. You're going to take 20 eggs or 30 eggs. You're going to put them in. You're going to discard what you want. You're going to take the best 5 eggs or 10 eggs, and you're going to take them, and you're going to then put them in the womb. And the first egg to connect, potentially, then the hormones are released in the woman. Her uterine lining says, okay, hey, we're pregnant, and doesn't allow other eggs to attach. Sometimes, and there's a case in Canada. So in Canada, one woman gave birth to 5 children engineered by IVF. She said she only wanted one, so she was actually able to sue her doctor for wrongful life and demand that he pay the cost of raising all the 4 children that she did not want. She only wanted 1 kid, but she ended up with 4 because this is how IVF works. And so she sued her doctor, saying, "Hey, you gave me 4. You have given me 5 kids. I only wanted 1 because you told me that only 1 egg would plant, knowing that you'd miscarried the other 3 or 4 or 5. You know what I mean?" So, the act of IVF itself, outside the act of sex, there's, like you said, there's different levels of morality here that we're sinking into. But the one is that you're taking life. You're creating life to take it, and you know. Would you kill 10 people for the life to save 1? You know what I mean? And the selfishness that might, so that you can have a child, you're going to kill off 10 others. Yeah, and thinking about it kind of analogously, you gave the kind of analogy of natural death versus something like euthanasia. But even kind of on the other side of this same issue, we're kind of roundabout talking about Humanae Vitae, or the church's teaching on sexuality and procreation. That one of the major themes of that is that sexuality should have both a unitive and procreative aspect. Yes. That and attempts to separate these from each other is really, really problematic. And the context for Humanae Vitae is contraception, artificial means of separating procreation from sex. And with contraception, you want the sex without you want the pleasure and the sex and everything comes with it. On the other hand, something like surrogacy is, I want the baby, but I don't want the unitive aspect. I don't want, and again, one of Pope Paul VI, one of his predictions towards the end of Humanae Vitae, he said that if we embrace this view of humanity, if we separate, our understanding of sexuality and procreation from natural law, from the church's teaching, you're going to experience a number of cultural effects, and one of those is that women's bodies are going to be exploited and be treated as machines. So we have a clear example of this in the science of trying to engineer. Even just the term engineering embryos is just so far removed from how the church views kind of the creation of human life.
This is sometimes a very terrible cross for people to carry. Right? You think of a married couple who's desiring to have children and realize that they can't, right? So it's a terrible cross to carry, and I don't want people to think that the church doesn't see the fact that this is a sad situation, that there's, but the fact that the right way out of this sad situation is not by destroying life. It is not by commercializing life. And when people are in a situation where they can't have children, I know people who, I'm sure you guys do too. It's very terrible cross to carry, right? But the answer to this question is not to go about these ways. Some people will say, well, I'll do anything to have children. And so they participate in things like IVF. I think we all know people who have participated in IVF, surrogacy, or whatever it might be. So how do we balance what the church teaches about life from people who say, well, I don't really care, because people who have gone through IVF and now they have children.
Yeah.
Will say, well, now I have my children and I don't regret it. I love my children. So how do we balance that? Because on one hand, it will never be and is not morally acceptable to participate in IVF or surrogacy or other means of separating the fruit of the sexual act with the sexual act. So where do we go there in helping people to understand? I know. I'll say what the Catechism says because me, I love the Catechism. But then I want us to go there because some people will say, well, it's easy for them to say, right?
Yeah.
And 2379, it says, spouses who still suffer from infertility after exhausting legitimate medical procedures should unite themselves with the Lord's cross, the source of all spiritual fecundity. They can give expression to their generosity by adopting abandoned children or performing demanding services for others. So here's a suggestion to people who have exhausted legitimate medical procedures. That's not saying surrogacy, IVF, all those different things. So legitimate medical procedures.
Things just to touch on those would be things like sometimes women are miscarrying because they don't have the proper hormones in place, and the church totally allows a woman to go and get that medical help to have the proper hormonal balance to have a child properly, right?
To create the natural conditions for conception.
Exactly. And so the church completely allows that because what you're doing is you're deficient. If you're deficient in vitamin B, I mean, that's not the case. But if you're deficient in one thing or another, the church is saying, go get healthy so that you can do this because this is the natural way of doing it, right?
There are two things that you said that are really, really important. But I think that kind of first thing that how do you encounter people? How do you where this seems like the last resort? A lot of times, and not in all cases, there are legitimate cases of infertility, or and you want to recognize how hard that actually is, or how, and especially when couples have done all that they can do kind of naturally and they still are bearing this cross. But a lot of times, and in a lot of cases, when you get to the point of IVF, you're already on damage control for this view of sexuality and procreation in the society. So you have this idea that a woman's reproductivity is something that you can manipulate, that you can modify, that you can change. So you have this kind of generally accepted practice that, as soon as a girl turns 12 or starts, automatically on birth control. And then you have, and we've had friends who, this is their story, that they've just short-circuited their physiology for 2 decades before they even think of, okay, now I actually want to have a child. They run into all kinds of problems with infertility, with their body doesn't know what to do properly because again they've kind of treated their body as their fertility as a disease, something to be medicated, something to be put off until a certain point, and then by the time they realize it, they doctors didn't tell them, they didn't read the illegible fine print on the actual these are some of the long-term consequences that if you the solution is just another technique, just another
we're seeing that a lot more now, especially now because those types of techniques started back in the 90s, and so what you're having now is you're having women that grew up in the 80s and the 90s as teenagers who started getting on the pill right away and everything else, and now they're hitting their 40s or let's say late 30s, and they're like, okay, well I have a couple of years left, now is the time where I want to start having kids, and they're not able to conceive. And part of that is damage that can be done through the pill, and we're realizing that more and more now that we've had 2 or 3 decades of a lot of women on the pill.
It's well documented.
It's well documented now that it's an actual thing. Now there is, though, I just want to point out, because some women are on the pill not because they want to regulate their cycle in a way for reproduction, meaning that they don't want to use it to discard the babies that might be, the the way the pill works is it sheds the uterine lining at a certain time and everything else, whether there's a baby or not. And so like you basically can have a mini abortion at the end of a cycle. And so it's really important that there are women out there that need the pill sometimes to regulate their cycle in a healthy way, meaning that they the way that they experience their cycle is in a way that needs to be medicated. Those women, what we would say in a Catholic world, I would say, is that they have to be very careful that they are not putting themselves at risk to get pregnant in that time, because you could abort a baby. You could be putting yourself through major damage as well. There is now more and more evidence that being on the pill could potentially create you to be infertile later on in your life when you maybe want to have kids. And so that's also things that I'm going to say parents as well as teenagers should be thinking about before going on the pill is that we have now 30 years of experience that are suggesting these are very likely scenarios here. And so those are all things. So just because you're on the pill doesn't mean you're on the pill for the wrong reasons. There are right reasons to be on the pill, but also that you have to be very careful. You can't just take it as I'm on the pill anyway, so I can just do whatever I want. You know what I mean? Yeah. So
the other aspect of what you said was like how do we encounter these families and more importantly the children of this process? And I think you can like again look analogously at another situation. It's like, okay, so say my wife and I conceived a baby before we were married. Yeah. That's not the proper condition for us to do that. How do we encounter the child? Well, we raise the child. We love the child. And for the same reason that like say a couple did this IVF route before they converted, before they became Catholic,
or they didn't realize it when they did it. Yeah.
Yes, the child is no less a child. The child is no less deserving of love. And again, they're eligible for baptism. They're like you have all these things. We're sympathetic to.
The sins of the parent don't ever reflect the life of the child. Never go on. So like if your parents did something wrong, it's never a thing on the child itself. The child is blameless in this. God created this life. God gave this life a soul. There's a reason why this child is around, and he loves this child no matter what. And so we treat all that life with respect. The sins of the father don't have anything to do with the life of the child. So we treat that life. That's why a baby born of surrogacy can still be baptized, right? That's why, but again, realizing that maybe if there's a surrogacy conditions around the baby being born and stuff, maybe that the parents need to be schooled a little bit more in understanding what exactly was going on here. And maybe it's not just a quick baptismal class. Maybe it's actual like RCIA class or something to understand what's going on. And so that when they're baptizing their child and trying to raise them in the faith, they understand exactly what the church teaches and why.
So going way back to how we started here to the Pope's comments.
Yeah.
He calls this deplorable. He people are kind of surprised. Remember we talked about, everyone looks at Pope Francis as kind of their grandfather figure. So for him to use words like deplorable, of course, make the headlines, right? He's not the first Pope to speak out against these sort of things. We'll give those resources at the end of this episode. So he calls it deplorable. He's calling on nations to stop this commercialized surrogacy. The problem goes much deeper, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Like right from the get-go, people no longer have a holy view of the sexual act.
It's a transaction.
Right. And the problem goes deeper than surrogacy, IVF, whatever, the pill. Mm-hmm. Right from the get-go, in this world where we're becoming more commercialized in general, and we're consumers really, we treat everything in that way. Yeah. Sex is something that is available to people when they watch online.
It's a right.
It's and
versus
you can even see
a gift.
People how they interact in sexualized ways, or how television movies portray it today. How on earth do we ever restore a holy way of looking at the sexual act? It's one of those things where, sure, I think it's fantastic that the Pope used this speech to diplomats to bring up this topic. Like he could have talked about all sorts of different things. Yeah. And he said that no, this aspect of human dignity is important, right? And then it's like, but we have so much work to do. Yeah. Like, you mentioned like, kids at 12, 13, they're put on the pill right off the bat. Kids, the studies are showing that as early as grade 5, kids are watching pornography. Grade 5, is that what I said?
Yep.
Grade 5.
Yep.
Like where people are just cohabitating and going from sexual partner to sexual partner. It's just such a destructive way of living God's plan for sexuality. So then when the Pope says something like IVF, surrogacy is deplorable, and we start looking at surrogacy and IVF and all these different things, where in the world do we even get people to say, you're right, maybe we should go back to try, maybe the unitive aspect of sex to really try to procreate?
I think that's what the Pope doing this is part of that step, right? Is because a lot of people, what is the church known for around the world when we talk about things like abortion? Abortion is one of those things. So life begins at conception, and that we believe that, so that they're like, okay, well, the church wants babies, so this is a way to have babies, but the church stands by the same teaching either side of the fence. It's no, there's a proper way to do this, there's a natural way to do this, and this is how we do it. And so the Pope bringing that to attention kind of, I think, shocked the world in the way that how they understood what the church actually stands for when it comes to life. And then a lot of times we hide behind the, I'm going to say we present ourselves as negligible to what's actually going on in these processes, medical processes and everything else. We talked a long time ago about stem cell research when we talk about the COVID vaccines and everything else. We hide behind not knowing some of this stuff to we're just innocent of it. You're not innocent of it so you have to kind of go and you have to know what's going on. You have to understand what's going on. So we call people to do that.
Yeah, to look at the question of like, how do we deal with it? Like, where do we start? To kind of address this, and like we really need to embody as families, as people, the church's teaching on family, sexuality, procreation, and walk beside along with people who are struggling in certain situations. Like a lot of times these discussions about, the starting point for the discussion is the moral prohibition. You can't do this, you can't do this. And a lot of times people just kind of write you off and be like, okay, well, you're out of touch. Like you don't understand.
I'm not going to talk to you about this anymore.
You don't understand how painful this situation is. Whereas, if we are, as Catholics, as families, as communities, we're actually living this out. We've gone to the effort of understanding, reading Humana Vitae, reading Theology of the Body, understanding the church's teaching, and more than just understanding, practicing fertility awareness-based methods, naprotechnology. I can't count the number of times that my wife has had a conversation with someone not well versed in the church's theology of sexuality, just talking about infertility. I mean, like, have you heard of this? Have you heard of this is the way of working with your body's natural processes. It's an invitation to look at sexuality and procreation through the lens of what the church teaches. So again, really, not entering the discussion at this kind of contentious, moral prohibition level, but actually journeying alongside people, embodying the teaching of the church, and people see the appeal of it. Or there is kind of fertile ground there. If I can,
boom. Yeah. I think people hide a lot of times from the embarrassment when we talk about sex. Sex is always seems to be private. Part of that is because we can feel guilty when it comes to things around the bedroom. But the church holds that done correctly, sex is such a beautiful gift. It's one of the few times, as we talk about heaven touches down on earth, we have it in the Eucharist. Heaven comes down in transubstantiation, but the other time that heaven kind of opens up and God comes and is like does a miracle on earth is every minute of every day is during conception. Like God puts a little soul inside that at every, that's the time that heaven opens up. So sex is such a beautiful thing. We can't be scared of that, but we also have to then know why the church teaches what it teaches. We have a whole few generations, I'm going to say at this point, who just know that a bunch of priests and nuns told them at school one time that they're not allowed to have sex.
Right.
And so the church is against sex because the priests and nuns couldn't have it. They don't realize that the priests and nuns that taught them this stuff actually know about sex. They actually took a vow to give up the life of sex, of family, of having children. That there's a natural desire in every single person to want to have children, especially in that intimate relationship within a marriage. Matt, you said that before. It's in the marital vows themselves that you are open to life. The wanting children is not a bad thing. It's a true desire. It's instinctual even. You know what I mean? And it can be such a hard thing to have to live with that natural desire and not be able to fulfill it. And so the church does give us other options. I mean, there are things like adoption. There are things like, you know what I mean? And there are a lot of medical things that are allowed by the church. And so exhausting those first, maybe looking at adoption, and then the church suggests other ways is maybe looking how you can be, how you can fulfill your life in the church through other ways. You know what I mean? And so,
yeah, you mentioned other options like medical options that are permitted morally, right? And obviously we don't have time to go through those things, which would have been nice to offer some of them. But there's lots of resources online for people. If you search up like Catholic infertility resources on Google, lots of places online where people are gathering together and helping each other through infertility in the way that would be morally acceptable. So that's a quick little Google search away. If people want to know more about what the church teaches, I know as recent as 2008, the congregation or the dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith released a document called Dignitas Personae, the dignity of the human being. Talks about the church's teaching on these things. Pope John Paul II wrote an encyclical called The Gospel of Life in 1995. It's excellent. It's in Latin. It's Evangelium Vitae. Lots of things online for people to read. Lots of resources online. Lots of online support groups as well for people who are going through infertility. So we're gonna have to leave this conversation here. I know it's a bit of a heavy one, and people might not understand the church's teaching on this or not feel comfortable with it. But at the end of the day, the Lord has provided such a beautiful gift in children, and in any gift that the Lord provides for us, there's always ways where it could be taken advantage of in different ways that maybe are less morally acceptable. It's one of those things that are hard to digest, but I think is still a beautiful teaching of the church that likes to preserve the dignity of life at every stage, right from conception to natural death. So if people have questions, comments to add to this conversation, you can drop them below or in the comments, or you can drop us a line at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com, and we'll send all those questions to Josh or Matt, not I. I'm not going to answer any of them. But that's all the time we have on this episode. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milgen, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.